"If you can't handle a tray, Grandpa, stay home," sneered a man as the elderly veteran struggled on the rocking deck. People laughed. The waitress looked away. The old soldier kept moving silently. But in the corner, an army colonel stood up. No words, just action. The entire restaurant fell quiet. Walter Mitchell, 72, arrived at the Anchor precisely at 9:15 a.m., just as he had every Sunday for the past 8 years. The retired Army sergeant moved with painful deliberation, each step a testament to the spinal injury he'd sustained when his military vehicle hit an IED outside Fallujah 15 years earlier. Doctors said he'd never walk again. Walter had other plans. His weathered face, deeply lined and sun-spotted, spoke of decades of hardship. His one straight military posture had given way to a pronounced stoop. Wisps of thin white hair clung to his scalp, and his threadbare plaid shirt and worn khakis hung loosely on his diminished frame. Yet his eyes remained sharp, alert, carrying the unmistakable vigilance of a combat veteran. Today, like all days, he relied on his metal cane, its handle polished smooth from years of use. He nodded at Emma, the hostess who knew his order by heart. Black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, no butter. Walter preferred the self-service counter despite his disability. Carrying his own tray aboard the gently rocking converted fishing vessel was difficult, but preserved something military men like him valued above comfort: independence. Walter placed his cane carefully against the counter, steadied himself against the boat's gentle motion, and gripped the tray with both hands. The journey across the busy restaurant deck was slow, deliberate, each step calculated to prevent his coffee from spilling. From a corner table facing the harbor, for men in matching golf polos and visors watched his progress. Weekend tourists drinking beers despite the early hour. "Look at this one muttered, loudly enough to be heard over the clinking of silverware. "Takes forever to cross 10 feet of deck." Walter continued his careful journey, eyes focused on his destination. The seat by the starboard rail where the morning sun would warm his aching back. "Probably fakes the limp to get the veteran's discount," another added, louder this time. The restaurant's ambient noise dipped. Emma hesitated by the kitchen door, coffee pot in hand. She'd heard the comment, as had several nearby customers who subtly found their plates fascinating. Walter said nothing, his expression unchanged as he finally reached his table and began the careful choreography of setting down his tray while maintaining his balance. His hand trembled slightly, more from age than the comments, and a fork slipped from the tray, clattering to the wooden deck beside his seat. No one moved to help. As Walter began the painful process of lowering himself, bracing against the table edge, the man directly behind him snickered. "I'd help, but I don't do cosplay veterans." What no one in the restaurant had noticed was the man sitting in the far corner booth, dressed in a simple but impeccably pressed button-down shirt. Colonel Edward Thompson had observed the entire interaction. His coffee sat untouched, his attention entirely focused on Walter and the men mocking him. At 68, with 30 years of military service, Thompson had the kind of commanding presence that didn't require volume or flash. He had noticed Walter immediately. Military men often recognize each other even across generations, and had watched the scene unfold with growing tension, his jaw tightening with each snide comment. When the fork fell and no one moved to help, something shifted in his expression, a decision being made. One of the men in the golf shirts finally noticed the colonel's unwavering stare. Perhaps feeling emboldened by his friends or the morning beer, he called out, "Hey, old-timer, want to back him up, or are you just another pretend hero too?" Conversations faltered as the confrontation grew more direct. Walter continued arranging his breakfast, seemingly oblivious, though the slight stiffening of his stooped shoulders suggested otherwise. Colonel Thompson stood slowly. His movement was unhurried but deliberate, the kind of measured control that suggested far more authority than any rushed reaction. Without acknowledging the hecklers, he walked directly to Walter's table. He didn't speak, didn't introduce himself, didn't create a scene. Instead, he bent down and picked up the fallen fork that still lay on the deck. He placed it gently on the edge of Walter's table. Then he took a step back and stood, not beside the booth, but directly behind Walter's seat. His posture shifted automatically to the formal position of attention, hands at his sides, feet at a precise angle, eyes forward, the ramrod straight stance of a soldier rendering honor. The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of the kitchen and the gentle slapping of waves against the hull seemed to fade away. It was a simple act, a military man standing at attention behind a seated veteran, but the message required no explanation to anyone watching. This man deserves respect, and I stand with him. A server stopped mid-step. Coffee pot still tilted over a customer's cup. The hostess at the front counter straightened instinctively, responding to the sudden shift in atmosphere. Even Captain Kent, who had been checking reservations at his podium, turned to observe the scene. The men in golf attire fell silent, their smirks fading as they registered not just the colonel's bearing, but the unmistakable seriousness of his posture. For 30 seconds, no one in the anchor spoke. No silverware clinked against plates. No coffee cups returned to saucers. Just the sound of the distant gulls and the gentle creaking of the converted fishing vessel. The colonel remained at attention, a living statue of dignity guarding an elder warrior's meal. After what seemed like an eternity of silence, Colonel Thompson finally shifted his stance. He remained standing but turned to face the golf enthusiasts. His expression wasn't angry but resolute. He reached into his pocket and removed a weathered photograph in a clear plastic sleeve. Without speaking, he held it up for everyone to see. The photograph, yellow with age, showed a much younger Walter Mitchell in combat fatigues in a dusty, debris-strewn street. His face was streaked with dust and what might have been blood, but his expression showed the same quiet determination he still carried. In his arms, he carried a wounded soldier. This man, the colonel finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant, carried me out of an ambush convoy in Fallujah in 2004, 3 miles through active combat zones with shrapnel in his own back. He lowered the photograph slightly, making direct eye contact with the men who had been mocking Walter. Sergeant Mitchell is the reason I'm alive today. The reason I was able to have a family. The reason I eventually earned this rank. Walter continued eating, his focus on his plate, though his hand had stilled on his fork. This was not a story he had shared with the staff at the anchor. Not out of modesty, but because some memories belong only to those who earned them. 5 men in our unit died that day. I would have been the 6th if not for him, Thompson continued, his voice steady. When the doctors told him he'd never walk again because of his injuries, he spent 2 years proving them wrong, just so he could stand at their funerals and honor their sacrifice. One of the hecklers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We didn't know, he stammered. You didn't ask. The colonel replied simply, no accusation in his tone, just quiet certainty. He turned toward Emma, who stood frozen with her coffee pot. I'd like to cover Sergeant Mitchell's meal today. Then, raising his voice slightly to address the staff, he added, and I'd like everyone here to know that this ship now stands under his protection, at least as far as the United States Army is concerned. From the entrance of the restaurant, Captain Thomas Kent approached. The retired Navy man's expression suggested he had been watching the scene unfold. I saw everything, he said, approaching Walter's table. And I'd like to ask your permission for something, Sergeant Mitchell. Walter finally looked up, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. I'd like to name this table after you. Officially, Kent gestured to the starboard rail seat where Walter had eaten every Sunday for years. If that's all right with you, Sergeant. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Walter's expression softened slightly. No need for that, Thomas. There's every need, Kent insisted, glancing around at his silent customers. Some lessons are worth making permanent. The golf enthusiasts had fallen completely silent, the weight of the colonel's revelation and their own behavior settling heavily upon them. 1 week later, Walter arrived at the anchor for his usual Sunday breakfast. As he made his slow, determined way across the gently rocking deck, he noticed something different. Above his regular table by the starboard rail, a small brass plaque had been installed, polished to a high shine, reading, "Reserved for Sergeant Walter Mitchell," still standing. Beneath it hung a framed copy of the photograph the colonel had shown, Walter carrying a wounded soldier through the war-torn streets of Fallujah. Captain Kent must have arranged to get a copy. As Walter made his way to his seat, he noticed the same group of men from the previous Sunday, sitting quietly at a table near the entrance. When they saw him, they stood, not mockingly, but with genuine regret. The one who had been most vocal approached cautiously. "Sergeant Mitchell," he began, "we came back to apologize properly. What we did was unforgivable." Walter studied them for a moment in their golf shirts and visors. They looked younger somehow, less intimidating than they had tried to appear the previous week. "You already apologized," Walter replied simply. "Not properly," the man insisted. "My uncle served in Afghanistan. He'd be ashamed of what I did." Walter nodded once, then said something that surprised everyone listening. "Next time, sit with me before you laugh behind me. You might learn something worth knowing." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was an opening, an invitation to bridge a gap rather than widen it. As Walter settled into his seat, the door opened again. Colonel Thompson entered, now in casual clothes, but carrying himself with the same military bearing. He nodded to Walter, then took a seat 2 tables away, close enough to acknowledge their connection, but not presuming a familiarity they hadn't established. Walter caught the colonel's eye and gestured to the empty seat across from him. Thompson accepted the invitation with a small nod of thanks. Emma approached their table, now wearing a small army pin on her apron, a gift from Walter, given to her after the previous Sunday's events. She had served him for years without knowing his story. Now that she did, she wore the symbol with pride. "Coffee, gentlemen?" she asked. "Black." They answered simultaneously, then exchanged a brief smile of men who recognized a habit in each other. In the weeks that followed, a new Sunday tradition emerged at the Anchor. Walter's table was always reserved for him, but rarely did he sit alone. Colonel Thompson became a regular. Other veterans from town began to stop by. Sometimes they shared stories. More often, they simply shared space, the comfortable silence of men and women who understood each other without words. Captain Kent noticed that business improved on Sundays, not because of any promotion or special, but because people wanted to be in a place where honor still meant something. The brass plaque became something of a local landmark. Parents would bring their children by and explain in hushed tones why that particular table was special. Some took photos. Others simply nodded respectfully when they passed. Emma noticed that whenever Walter entered a restaurant, conversations would briefly pause, not out of awkwardness but respect, and she never once had to ask anyone to vacate his reserved table. Somehow, it was always empty, waiting for its rightful occupant. 6 months after that fateful Sunday, Captain Kent hosted a special dinner aboard the Anchor. The guest list included Walter, Colonel Thompson, and a dozen other veterans from different eras and branches of service. The golf enthusiasts were there too, now regular Sunday patrons who had traded mockery for mentorship, listening to the veteran stories with genuine interest. Walter, still stooped but somehow standing taller these days, raised his glass in a toast. "To the fallen," he said simply. "To the fallen," the room echoed. After dinner, as sunset painted the harbor in gold and crimson, Walter stood by the rail, looking out over the water. Colonel Thompson joined him, and for a long moment neither spoke. 2 old soldiers watching the day end. "You know," Thompson finally said, "that day in Fallujah, when you pulled me out, I never asked why. Most men would have taken cover, waited for backup. Walter didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the horizon. Did what needed doing," he said, "same as you would have done." "Maybe," Thompson allowed, "but that's the thing about courage, isn't it? We never know for sure until the moment arrives." Walter nodded slightly. "That's why we train. So when thinking stops, doing starts." A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, approached them hesitantly, his parents watching nervously from a few feet away. "Sir," he addressed Walter, "my dad says you're a hero. Is that true?" Walter turned, studying the boy with kind eyes. "No, son, just a soldier who did his job." "But you saved people." Walter smiled slightly. "That was a job." The boy seemed to consider this, then asked, "Can I shake your hand?" Walter extended his weathered hand, and the boy shook it solemnly, as if completing a sacred ritual. Later, as Walter made his slow way home, he reflected that perhaps the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with small, daily acts of courage and respect. Standing up when it would be easier to stay seated, speaking up when silence would be simpler, extending a hand when others pull away. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voice, sometimes true strength whispers. Sometimes it simply stands, silent and unwavering, like an old soldier with a cane who refuses to be defined by his wounds. If you believe quiet dignity speaks louder than cruel mockery, comment respect below. And if you know a veteran, take a moment today to stand with them. Sometimes that's all the recognition a true hero needs.